Director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy.
So Richard, Mr. Bloch, Mr. Hagol, mayors from around Israel, it's really an honor to be here with you and with the distinguished panel, especially on the eve of such an important date. I want to start with what Professor Elie Wiesel said. Professor Wiesel said that we're living in a time of great urgency. And then he went on to correct himself and he said, no, we're not living in a time of great urgency. We're living in a time of an emergency. And he said this in 2003, and never before was he so concerned about the rise of global anti-Semitism since 1945. From 2003 to 2017, this emergency, in our view at ISGAP, is becoming more relevant, more important, and more concerning. Yesterday I came from McGill University in Montreal, my hometown, and I would argue that the wave of anti-Semitism starts in the Middle East. It's coming across into Europe, and a mix of migration and sort of this philosophical, intellectual moment coming from Europe, it's sweeping into North America. I had a meeting with the provost of McGill University yesterday, my alma mater, where I went to do my first degree, and three things happened at McGill in the last year. A few months ago, they had Punch a Zionist Day. My nephews, two nephews who go to McGill University for weeks, even though they go to the gym and they're not small guys and they're tough guys, were walking around nervous to go to school, to go to campus. A few weeks ago, the McGill newspaper passed a resolution that all pro-Zionist or pro-Israeli articles or advertisements are officially banned from the McGill newspaper. 2 weeks ago, 3 Jewish members of the student union were kicked off the student union by the council because they were opposed to BDS. Ladies and gentlemen, it's here. It's coming from Europe, it's coming from Canada, it's coming from the Gulf, and it's in your country, it's in your institutions. As Elie Wiesel said, anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it doesn't end with Jews. That once this hatred is unleashed upon society, it knows no boundaries, and tragically, Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism only too clearly demonstrates this all too well. I did a study in 2005 with an eminent scholar at Yale University, Edward Kaplan. We interviewed 5,000 people in 10 European countries, and basically we showed the correlation, the strong correlation between classical forms of anti-Semitism and what we called Israel bashing. In fact, those who are Israel bashers are 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense. So the correlation is off the charts. Today, the dominant form of anti-Semitism, as the ambassador said earlier, there's different phases of anti-Semitism. There's, in my opinion, there's 3 major forms of anti-Semitism. There's the religious form of anti-Semitism, the belief that because the Jews don't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, that they're blinded by evil and they can't have redemption. And what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that people believe not only was the individual Jew hindered from redemption, but the fact that they don't accept the Messiah, they're hindering global redemption. When the paradigm shift went from religion to the dominant worldview of race and of nation, the Jews were the wrong race, the wrong ethnicity, and they were poisoning the purity of the Aryan white nation and the white race, and they had to be eliminated. And this form of anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust. Those forms of anti-Semitism, racist anti-Semitism and religious anti-Semitism, although they still exist, and there's places like Hungary or in Charlottesville where those old anti-Semitisms are around. In fact, the fact that in Charlottesville people came with no hoods, with no masks on their face, and they came proudly, says something about the climate that we're living in this country. that KKK members and Nazis and anti-Semites and racists and homophobes can march proudly with no social cost, or they figure no social cost, ought to be a moment of concern, of great concern. But the most dominant form of anti-Semitism, of all the anti-Semitisms, is the attack on who Jews are as a people and our connection to the land of Israel, our cultural, religious claim and connection to Israel. I would argue that for many years the communities in the diaspora, particularly this community, thought that the problems of our cousins in Israel was a problem for our poor cousins over there. That the demonization of Israel, the dehumanization of Israel, was in part because our brothers in Israel were a little bit stubborn. And if they could only figure out and solve their problems, there'll be peace and all will be well. People like Brzezinski and others in the old anti-Semitism argued that the stubbornness of the Israelis was causing jihad. And if only the Israelis would change or perhaps disappear, the problems of radical political Islam would go away as well and peace would break out. It's the old anti-Semitic canard in a new dress. And some of us were complacent. But now we see that it's not just the Israelis that are under attack by radical political Islam and the so-called left, because it's not left. We see now that diaspora communities in France and Belgium, throughout Europe, who have a strong affinity to Israel, who walk to synagogues, who go to Jewish student organization at universities, are now targeted as well. Because if Israel is an apartheid, racist, fascist, colonial entity, then people walking to shul, or young people going in the postmodern liberal space of a university, going to a Chabad house or to a Hillel or to a Jewish student organization, they become part of the problem as well, and they are being targeted. In fact, many studies are starting to show, people like Barry Cosman and other scholars are showing that anti-Semitism affects young people at a much greater level in Europe and in North America than it does elderly people. People over 50 experience anti-Semitism differently than people under 50, particularly students. So we have the rise of radical political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Iranian revolutionary regime that has taken, and I'm choosing my words carefully, Nazi ideology, the protocols of the elders of Zion, the most pernicious forms of anti-Semitism that justified the removal of Jews from European society and justified the extermination of Jews in Europe. Political Islam takes this at its core ideology, and we in the West, particularly in North America, do not pay enough attention to ideology. Ideology is very important, particularly in this war against the Jewish people. So they take Nazi ideology, put it at the center of their movement. It's not the rantings and ravings of the military wing, or Sheikh Kawadari got up in a bad mood one day and starts quoting from the protocols of the elders of Zion. This is their core ideology. And we in this country, for all sorts of reasons, have put this issue to a side. For political, for geostrategical reasons, we put this to the side. But Emanuel Levinas, the great Jewish professor who took Talmudic text and brought it to the university, teaches us that we become human the instant we see our face in the face of the other. This is Talmudic Jewish learning. We're all created in the image of God. We become human when we see our face in the face of the other. Levinas teaches us that any political movement that cannot see all human beings as human, as created in the image of God, there is no negotiation with them. You have to struggle with them, to destroy them at all levels, including ideologically. Yosef Kawadari, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, the founder of Islamic studies at Oxford University, sat on the board of trustees of the first group of trustees at Oxford University, the Muslim Brotherhood starting at Oxford University, Islamic studies. He calls for all believers to complete the work of Hitler. Oxford University, the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar. We know that the relations that we have with Qatar How much money from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from Iran is coming into our institutions, into the best universities of the United States of America, into the best media outlets in the United States of America? What is the impact on the institutions that safeguard, that are the key to safeguarding democratic societies, that are being bought and are being sold to people with an ideology that thinks that Jews emanate from the urines of donkeys, that we emanate from apes and pigs, that women are of a lower citizenship than men, that gay people should be killed, that Jews must be annihilated by true believers? What happens when we have sold these institutions to these type of people with these type of ideologies? For 2 pieces of silver, what is happening, not just in Europe, not just in Syria and Iraq, 600,000 dead, 14 million refugees. And what are we doing? What are we doing here? And I would argue that when my grandparents' generation put pennies, because that's all they had, in the pishka so that Israel could be born and that people can have a refrigerator or electricity, my question to this community is, what are we doing to safeguarding American democracy, to safeguarding our children and grandchildren at the best universities in this country that are certainly being influenced by political Islam, by investments that are creating, not just on the campus, but in the classroom, institutions that propagate and a soft selling of political Islam? Georgetown, Oxford, Tariq Ramadan. The list of scholars funded by the Muslim Brotherhood is long and rich. And this is, I guess, the challenge for us today. As we here in the United States of America fighting anti-Semitism, I think that we also have to take a serious look at our institutions. Everybody wants to stay in their lane. Everybody wants to stay in their lane, to get ahead in politics, to get ahead in the academy, to get your PhD, to get a postdoc, to get tenured. Everybody wants to stay in the firm. Everybody wants to be at a good media outlet, so we're all staying in our lanes. But ladies and gentlemen, the running of amok of genocide in Syria, of refugees flooding into Turkey, flooding into Europe, flooding into European cities, at what point do we say it's enough? At what point do we say in this country, the country that hosts the most URLs of terror and radical political Islam in the world? Yes, we have the First Amendment. Yes, there's freedom of speech in this country. And unlike Canada and Europe and Israel, there is not hate legislation as such. But what happens when people from non-democratic countries are using the internet and locating their domain here, where there's freedom, and propagating their hatred throughout the world? What happens then? Are non-American citizens without the tradition of democracy able to have access to this free internet? These are questions. So, in the words of Elie Wiesel, it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. The rise of political Islam, and perhaps even more dangerously, the acquiescence of those of us in the West who claim to be liberal. To be liberal means you believe in strong citizenship, equality under the law for everybody regardless of race and gender and language and religion. That's what liberals believe in. And I submit to you that we need to take stock here today of what we're doing in this generation, not only to renew our democratic commitment to renewing democratic societies and institutions here in the United States, but as Jews and as Zionists, what are we putting up with? Why can't anti-Semitism be eliminated? Why not? We can eliminate racism, we can take action against sexism and homophobia. Great strides have been made in decades. Why not on anti-Semitism? Why do we have to limit ourselves? Let's end anti-Semitism. And let's renew our commitment in this generation of Israel, who is surrounded by a catastrophe of failing states and of an ideology that is diametrically opposed to everything that a liberal democratic society believes in. And I think we need to take a stand there and as well over here. Thank you.
Yossi Hollander describes himself